identity, privacy, and finance. Today we have with us Mr. Lavlesh Chabra, Managing Director in Product Management at Goldman & Sachs. Lavlesh is a PGPX alum from the batch of 2008 and 9. He's recently joined Goldman & Sachs and is leading the platformization of GS's identity and access management suite of products. Prior to joining Goldman & Sachs, Lavlesh worked at Verizon Media and was responsible for multiple consumer-facing platforms, including identity, privacy, payments, and mobiles. In, in his 20 plus years of career, Lavlesh has held a multitude of roles within the technology space and has worked for large successful enterprises like IBM, Oracle, Pfizer, General Electronics, Yahoo, and Verizon. Lavlesh is currently based out of the San Francisco Bay Area in California. In his free time, he spends time building Legos and cooking experimental dishes. So without much further ado, I present to you Mr. Lavlesh Chabra.
Hey, thank you, Nitika, for that. Hi all. I'm really excited to be back and chatting with the PGPX crowd. In another year, I would have loved to come on campus and be part of this conversation. And this is probably the best we could do, given that it's not another year, it's 2020, right? Everything that can go wrong has largely gone wrong this year. So let's try and make the best of this hour or so that we have. I'll, just in the interest of sort of getting to know each other, I will spend a couple of minutes talking about my journey post PGPX. We can kind of leave the pre-PGPX for another session when it's a bit more in-person, casual, that kind of chat. But I graduated, like Nitika said, in 2009, right? And my entire batch saw a recession up close like nobody else did, right? When we got to the campus, the market was kind of reasonably stable. And when we started studying, I want to say maybe week 5 or week 6, Lehman Brothers went down, right? And then onwards, the entire market went down. So we were unusually close to the case studies we were studying, because a lot of us had investments that went from 20, 30 lakh Indian rupees down to near zero overnight. And then the next morning, you would have an ethics professor or a corporate governance professor come and talk to you about how that poor set of decisions or badly governed companies were going downhill. You were like, yeah, but I lost a lot of money. How do I get it back? I'm a student, right? And I've also amassed this loan as part of becoming a student. Anyway, fast forward to graduation time, and there were not a lot of jobs for the taking, but we took what we got. I mean, most of the batch did get placed. But the aspirations that you had coming in versus the reality that hit home when you left were quite different. They were poles apart. Right. So I started out as a salesperson, almost a frontline salesperson for IBM's consulting division. I was hired to go consult, but there wasn't anything to go consult on. So we all essentially turned into salespeople. So I did, cold calling, door-to-door sales to, CIO offices and whatnot. I did that for about a year. It was fun while it lasted, but it had to be short-lived because it wasn't my calling, right? My calling has always been around building things, right? And that's where my love for Legos also comes in, because you could take the same set of Legos and come up with something entirely different, right, in a matter of minutes. So it was always about building things. And I went back to IBM and said, hey, I love the role you gave me. It paid the bills, but I'm kind of done here. What can we do, right? So they gave me a role here in the US, working for their insurance business with Nationwide Insurance, which is an auto insurance company. So I led a reasonably large-sized agile transformation effort. Was not product management, so I'm going to kind of gloss over that a little bit here. And then, as about a year of that ended, I started looking for a job here, and I wanted to walk away from consulting and more into full-time. And that's when Yahoo's job came along. I joined Yahoo as a program manager for the Yahoo local business, essentially hyperlocal news, hyperlocal content, and hyperlocal sort of events. We built that product, launched it as an experiment, didn't do that well. And in that 1 year of building and launching, we had about 4 CEO changes. So, if you thought you knew what recession looks like, come talk to me someday about what it looks like when every 2 months the corporate strategy changes, right? So at the end of it, we got Marissa Mayer, who was a very product-focused person. And while that was happening, I was also looking to transition into product management, because product managers are the ones that kind of define what to build and work closely with engineers on how to build and all that. So as Marissa joined, we got a company strategy established on looking forward, how will the product grow, how will we execute, and things like that. And I gravitated towards this team called identity. They seem to have really hard set of problems at their hands. And sort of what attracted me to it was this idea of a good fight, right? Because when you're working in the identity/security space, there will always be more bad actors than there is of us, right? My team, right? We had a small team at the time, less than 20 people total, right? Including product management, design, engineering, data science, abuse prevention, all of that combined was a really small team, right? But the sales pitch that worked for me was we have a big fight, we have a good reason to fight, and there's always going to be more of them, but we have to figure out how to win, right? So that was exciting. I did that. I worked in the identity team for the next 7 years. First 4 years, I essentially did job rotations within the team. So every 3 months or so, I'd go up to my manager and say, hey, what else can I learn? What else can I learn, right? That was sort of the investment in myself as well as in the team, because I was committed to sticking around long term. So I wanted to make sure I am among the best educated about the industry as well as about the product that we built, right? And as I get into the talk, I'll cover a little bit of the product and platform kind of play that I kind of learned there. And after about 4 years of being in the team, I took the responsibility of leading the team. So I became the VP of product and engineering, and later on also took responsibility for user experience and design. Excellent GM style role. I did that for another 3 years. And then, sort of middle of this year, right, as the pandemic was about to hit, I entered the job market, right? Somehow my entry into the job market is timed with these large events. I don't know how that happens, but it is. But it worked out okay this time. I wanted to focus on a more vertical specialization than a GM style role. I'd done the GM style role for a while. I kind of knew how to play the game. I was a trusted advisor to the CTO and then also to the CEO on product topics. So I had been sort of close enough to know that getting back to a GM style role is going to be okay. I can get that done. But what I really wanted was to find an opportunity where I cultivate a product organization, a product culture, and sort of drive that change, right? And that needs a little more deeper technical expertise. I say technical, i.e. from a product perspective, right? And I wanted to find an opportunity like that. And that's where Goldman Sachs came along. They're a 150-year-old large established bank. I'm sure that name rings a bell for everybody on our campuses, right? And now, if you heard their Investor Day talks for 2020, right, they're focused on turning their core competencies in the financial world into a technical advantage and sort of building on the API economy and opening up their core competencies for others to sort of utilize as services. So as part of that, they were looking to drive a culture change on how software products get built, not the financial products, but software products get built. And they were looking to hire some seasoned professionals from the Silicon Valley. So it kind of was like a match that got made. And I recently joined Goldman Sachs. So I'm going to focus my talk. I'm going to start presenting here in a minute. I'm going to focus my talk largely on the PM learnings I've had. A lot of this content is my personal, or there are a couple of references where I shamelessly stole somebody's quotation and things like that. But none of this is Goldman or Yahoo or Verizon endorsement. This is all my own content. And even after the talk, if you have thoughts, questions, ideas you want to bounce off of me, feel free to reach out. Nitika has my phone number. I'm on LinkedIn, fairly active. So feel free to reach out in any of those forums. So now let's get the Zoom screen share going, hopefully. Okay. No, okay. Trying to start it. All right. Are you able to see?
Yes, Lavlesh, it's visible.
All right, awesome. So like I said, the talk is focused on product management. So the first question, right, is what is product management? Is it an art? Is it a science, right? And the more I think about it and the more experienced I've gained, I think it is more an art, less a science, because I can't figure out the formula for success for PMs. I can't figure out what is the one thing or the two things or the three ingredients that make a great PM. So it's a lot of art and less of science. It sits at the intersection of multiple disciplines, right? And we'll go through some of those in the next few slides, right? Too often, product managers get caught up in the execution rut, so they become more of a project manager and less of a product manager. And that's project management you can measure in hard skills. Product management is a lot more of these soft skills slash hard to define. So let's get a little bit deeper into that, right? First thing is, as a product manager, you need to focus on the problems that you're solving, not so much on the solutions. Solutions are great. That's how the problems get solved. But sometimes once the team starts the execution, it introduces a bias. And the bias is towards execution of the solution we first talked about, or the solution we set out to deliver, right? And over time, i.e., it takes 3, 6, 9 months sometimes to deliver the solution, sometimes even longer, right? And the problems have evolved. So your job as the PM is to stay focused on the problem to make sure you're delivering the quote right solution to that problem, right? And throughout the progress of the product development cycle, you have to stay focused on the problem. This is my favorite question or word, is you focus on the whys, right? This is not just about you understanding the why. You'll see that mentioned in a lot of places, like in the 5 whys framework. People talk about sort of continuously layered 5 level of questions, all starting with why this, why this, why this. So you can get to the core of the problem, right? Core of the pain point you're trying to solve. That's important. It's well and good, but you have to extend that beyond yourself. You have to establish, as the PM, a shared understanding of the whys, i.e., why did we start this journey? Why did the company decide to build a certain product, or why did a startup get funded? And that answer to that why should be the same if you wake up an engineer from the sleep, or the product manager from the sleep, or a designer, or a user researcher, or any discipline, right? Everybody should have the same understanding of the why. And that the job of a PM is to make sure that shared understanding gets established and gets talked about often. Establishing it at the start of the product development cycle isn't enough. You have to repeat it. Like one of my mentors and coaches once said, repetition makes the prayer stronger, right? Religious connotations aside, the idea is that if you repeat, people will remember, and they'll be ready to repeat when it's time for them to repeat, right? And one of the tools that we've seen used a lot, and I have seen used a lot, is Amazon's sort of Jeff Bezos dictated working backwards model, where you always start from the customer. You write a document that says, that covers working from the customer value back to the product you're going to build, or the problem you're solving, how this thing adds up in terms of value to the customer, value to the business, value to the developers, and things like that, right? And those documents, those memos become a vehicle for others to be able to share your story, right? Rather than relying on a slide deck like mine with a word on each slide and everybody being able to interpret it however, right? If you wrote a memo and everybody reads the memo and that memo has all of the related information you need to make a decision, or information that was used to make a decision, it helps everybody sort of align and have a level playing field. This is something I borrowed from Martin Erickson. He's one of the PMs I follow and occasionally chat with on product thoughts, right? So on a typical product development team, there are at least 3 core functions, right? There is the business, the feasibility from a business perspective for this product to bring value to us, the company, to our customers, our key stakeholders beyond customers. The UX, the user experience, right, which makes the product usable, and the technology that makes it feasible to actually build, right? A good product manager is going to sit right at the intersection of that Venn diagram, right? They are going to focus on maximizing business value. They're going to be the voice of customer. When you talk about UX, they're going to be the voice of the user in case of consumer products, right? They're going to be the advocate for the user. When you talk about a certain user flow, they're going to be the one passionately fighting for make the flow simpler, for make the product easier to use, right? And then they're also going to partner with engineers to make sure this is feasible in the given time frame. It gives the company a competitive edge with regards to the technology choices we're making, right? So they kind of straddle all of these different skills and help sort of make those decisions. In my own sort of learnings, product management decisions or product decisions are largely done by a triad, right? You always need to have your designers, your engineers, your PMs. This is the core group that builds the product. They need to be together and aligned on a decision. And alignment is a funny thing. It is not always about gaining consensus. It is about aligning towards a direction of execution. It is okay for a PM to say, this is my prerogative, this is my decision, so I'm deciding that the product goes in a given direction, right? Based on the product manager's decision. Everybody else should align and execute versus try to build consensus. The consensus, in my mind, is not a recipe for success. So what are platforms products, right? So platforms products are products that take the commonality, sort of the central set of pieces, and turn those into products that others can also use, right? By definition, a platform provides a vast set of services and systems that you can ship to third-party developers, to third-party product companies, as well as you can use the platforms yourself. So I'll take a minute here and talk about when I went to identity, what did I realize, right? Identity in our case for Yahoo was simply speaking a flow where a user gives a username, password. If the two things match, you let them in, right? On the face of it, it's a product. But behind the scenes, every Yahoo product will call us and say, is this user Lovelish? Do you think it is still Lovelish on this browser, right? Or various such questions come from system to system. So it's a platform, right? When we were sort of rebuilding this team as part of my job at Yahoo, right? New engineers would join and say, oh, is this a platform or is this a product? And the answer is it's both, right? There are a lot of products that are platforms as well as products. And I think that's what makes it even more fun and exciting to work on is you have to consume your own services as well as figure out how to externalize your services. So, like I alluded to, externalizing services that you build is key for a platform product, right? You should be using exactly what you're asking others to use, right? If you think about companies that are good platforms products, one example that comes to mind is Stripe. They started with a mission to build a payments platform for the internet, right? But is Stripe using the same platform, the same set of sort of features for their customers to pay them? I don't know the answer, but the likely answer is yes, because that's how you test, that's how you validate that the thing that you're building and that people are willing to pay for actually does what it's supposed to do, right? eBay started out as a company that wanted to build a platform for consumers, right? Stripe was a B2B platform. eBay is a consumer platform, and they both did great things by externalizing things that they built, by launching things that they built as a platform. Now let's talk about externalizing what you built already and opening up for others to use, right? And that example, the simplest one that comes to mind is social logins, right? So if you look at sign in with Google, for example, sign in with Yahoo, sign in with Facebook, now sign in with Apple, all of these were built for consumers to use on their core products, right? But then these got externalized for other parties to use. If you look at Amazon, they get a lot of credit for AWS, but they're also a seller's platform, right? That gets a lot less credit in the product space, but they started to build out a store for Amazon's own products that Amazon would sell, right? Sorry, Amazon's own sold products. But they are a very strong third-party business now, and it's flourishing. And there are PMs focused on growing that business, where it is peer-to-peer selling many times, right? And then the Apple developer ecosystem, right? Apple started out with apps will only be built by Apple's developers, and by the third or the fourth year of the iPhone, they had opened up the entire developer ecosystem, but they had kept their own QA. The reason to keep QA is quality matters, right? The end-to-end user experience matters. So a lot of these products are platforms. They don't just always brand themselves as such. And then APIs matter in this case, right? And why do I call APIs out here? Is by accepting that APIs matter, you treat developers of the other company as they are your first line customers. They need to be treated as customers at every touch point. That deals with technology shifts, changes you make to your technology contract between your product and theirs. And that sort of defines a little bit of the direction on how you innovate and how you move your products forward. It also defines choices you make early on in the life cycle to make sure what you choose is an extensible product and extensible platform. Again, why do companies want to invest in this space, right? Why as a business do I want to do this? Because it's recurring revenues. There's multiple revenue models. Not all are tied to like a subscription, you pay me X dollars a month, but they're all tied to one way or the other. You get a ongoing stream of revenue, right? eBay's example, you get revenue when somebody sells and somebody's buying, right? They don't have inventory holding costs, but they get money when people trade, right? Stripe's example, they get money when anybody pays another store. Shopify's example, they give you the entire store, right? Shopify creates the store for you. So they have a subscription fee and a transaction fee. So they kind of make money, on both sides of that transaction. Getting back to people like us, right? The product managers. So what is platforms product management, right? And I'm going to take a little bit longer on this slide because I'm really passionate about this. I think this is the hardest job there is for a PM, right? And the way I look at it is, if you are a B2B product manager, you get into the shoes of that CIO, that CTO, that head of HR, whoever is buying your product. You get into their shoes and you kind of come up with the decision-making framework, the problems they're facing, and the problems you want to solve for that audience, right? Whether it's the CIO, CTO, the head of HR, or whichever product you're building. If you're a B2C product manager, you end up getting into the shoes of your users, like the iPod example, right? Steve Jobs, famously was in love with music. He wanted to build something so you could carry more and more songs. So hence we got the iPod, right? So you can put yourself in the consumer's shoes. You can conduct consumer research. You can conduct all kinds of experiments to figure out what works, what doesn't. And that's that kind of a PM. Now talk about a platforms PM. Platforms PMs are, generally speaking, building products that are either B2B to B or B2B to C. Hardly ever do you build a platform that goes from you directly to the consumer, i.e. the end user, right? So if you take the examples of Stripe, Stripe is building APIs, or if you take the example of Shopify, maybe let's do Shopify. If you take the example of Shopify, right? Shopify is building a storefront. That storefront will have its own engineering team, its own sort of architectural direction for that engineering team. And then there is a consumer that uses that product, right? So as a PM that's building that platform, you have to put yourselves in the shoes of the developer that is integrating with you, the PM on that team, as well as the end user. So with regards to my own experience at Yahoo, right, I was the platforms product manager. I was always in the platforms organization there. And I had to build these flows, but a user never goes to the login page, right? A user doesn't say, oh, let me go log into Yahoo. They say, I want to go check my email. I want to go check my Yahoo Fantasy League or my Yahoo Finance portfolio, right? And for each of these, the user needs to be signed in, right? So now what I build should feel part of the flow, as well as the developers and the PMs on the other side should be willing to consume the newest feature I'm launching, right? So to me, I had to be in the shoes of the end user. I had to be in the shoes of the developer and the PMs on various different teams. It wasn't just one team within Yahoo, right? I was interacting with all of them. So that makes this job essentially harder than other PM's role, but also a lot more fun, right? So I'm going to dive into identity and fintech, and then sort of loop back to platforms and products. So as I alluded, uh, in my mind, all of these three are actually both. They are products and they are platforms, and we'll dive deeper into that. First thing is user experience, right? So in the case of identity, as well as privacy, as well as finance, all of us have our expectations on user experience. We kind of know, from habit and use of, banking systems and signing into various products, we have expectations as users. The PMs on these teams need to be maniacal about understanding user expectations, and when departing from it, explaining work within the flows, within the experience on why are we departing from it, and how is it valuable to the user? How does it bring quality experiences to the user? Next thing is security, right? In all of these three spaces, security is a very big deal. And it goes without saying that security should be very big deal regardless. Like in every product, if there is a security touch point, you should pay attention to it. But in all of these three spheres, security is almost like breathing, right? If you forget to breathe, there is a problem. And similarly, if you are an identity PM or a financial services PM, if you forget or overlook a security issue, that's a huge problem. So you as a PM need to be paying attention to that. There is a lot of regulation. In this one, I kind of called out more from a privacy perspective because that is an area with new regulations. There's GDPR, there's CCPA, there's a LGPD, I think the Brazil new privacy law. India is working on one. So regulation is growing faster than you can imagine right now in the financial space, also in the privacy space. So as a PM, you have to keep in touch with that and keep ahead of that. And normally, go back a second. Normally, when you look at these spaces, right, whether it is usability, whether it is security or regulation, they look like they're at odds with usability, i.e. you can have good user experience, but then you have security trade-offs. Or you can have excellent user experience, but I don't know that I can meet the regulation as it was intended. I think the key here for success for PMs is to do usability with security and regulation in mind. You don't want to put the burden of security on the user, i.e. let them choose a good password or let them be well disciplined around their banking details and whatnot. It is our job to ensure that users can't get it wrong. They have enough tools, we have enough controls in the system to make sure that they get it right. And they get it right all of the time. So just sort of diving a little bit deeper into finance, right? As I'm learning, I wanted to share a little bit of tidbits there also, right? KYC norms are a big deal. In the big tech space, we can get away with KYC having some errors. The users many times actually intentionally make errors, i.e. they will not disclose their date of birth properly. They'll use an alternate name. They'll come up with screen names that don't identify them. And that's all okay in the digital space. In the finance space, given that it's real money and sometimes it's a lot of money, the scale is huge, the user's KYC information as well as the KYC norms are fairly tight. Data protection and privacy in finance is a really big deal. So if you build a platform that powers other people's financial services, how is the consumer data protected? How is the business data protected? Who has access to the business data? Who has access to the consumer data? Because given the B2B2B or B2B2C nature of each transaction, there is layers of controls, right? Even the platform provider should not have access to view relationships, let alone specifics of data. So there is a lot of sensitivity around that, as well as legal contracts put in place to ensure that that sensitivity gets honored. The industry is ripe for disruption. If you think about it, with the cryptocurrency rise in the last maybe 5-7 years, right, as well as decentralized financial services rise, the industry is ripe for disruption. There is going to be a lot of new platforms coming out, offering different capabilities. The core idea there being, let the banks and other financial institutes focus on the core of their business. Let the technology be done by platforms, right? If you are a financial services provider, your product is actually the finance, the money, and how you trade, right? It's not the technology. And sort of burdening the every organization to go build its own technology is essentially going to slow down their innovation. And the idea of finance driven platforms is essentially to take that burden away and say, here is a set of APIs, a set of capabilities that any financial services provider can use to go build the product that they should be focusing on. And I wanted to just touch upon regulation quickly again. While I talked about privacy and regulation, that's kind of a big deal. But finance is a whole another level of regulation, right? On the one hand, in privacy, regulation is up and coming, and not all the regulators also fully understand the implications of what they ask for. On the financial side, regulation is present, it's incumbent, and it has been incumbent for many, many, many years. Now, the challenge is modernizing those regulations to today's times, right? There are rules that apply to money trading that don't equally apply to cryptocurrencies. Is that right? Is that not? Right? So there are a lot of challenges like that from a regulation perspective, and many times technology innovation has to be held back a little bit. You can do a lot more than what the regulation allows, and that's where a lot of the negotiation comes in. So the last section of my conversation or presentation here is just focusing on what makes a good platforms PM, right? And this is something that generally serves you well, regardless of which industry you're in or what role you're doing, is if you play the long game. If you inculcate the habit in yourself as well as within people around you to have long-term thinking and get your execution bias towards that long-term delivery, not towards the short-term trade-offs. Short-term trade-offs always seem urgent. They always seem like, the building's on fire. If I don't throw some water at it, it's going to burn down. But longer-term focus and longer-term sort of execution is what is going to make for a great platform and a great platform PM. End-to-end UX, I touched a bit on this, right? My page isn't as a platform PM if I have a UX, if I have a page that I expose, not always will you do, but if I have one, that's not the page users come for, right? In the Yahoo example, users don't come to say, oh, let me go check login out, right? And see how it works. Nobody does that. Nobody will ever do that. In the Shopify example, nobody goes to their checkout page and say, let me see what the checkout page looks like. Or in the Amazon example, no consumer goes to the product listing page to see how the third-party seller products are shown, right? That's our job. It's our job to look end to end. Why did the consumer get here? How did they get here? And where are they going to land after they exit my platform, right? And if you have a UX, your job has to be to drive that end-to-end thinking. Every other PM that works on your product is just going to be narrowly focused. You have to be really broad. And you have to almost force them, your partners across the organizations, whether your company or outside, to look at the end-to-end picture and sort of play along. Know where the puck is going. I know it's a cliche line, but I didn't come up with anything better, so I used it. The idea here is platforms cannot play with where the industry is right now. You need to be building products that are extensible, long-lived, but also ready for where the puck is going. You have to be ready for when the industry gets here, what are we going to do, right? Almost, if you want to be successful, you almost want to be there before the industry gets there. A good example for that is actually the iPhone launch itself, right? They kind of saw where the industry was going. Another good example is AWS. AWS figured out that there was a problem in data centers in private cloud, as we call it now, right? Every company didn't want to stand up their own data centers. And even when they did, they didn't have the ability to scale. The biggest USP that AWS sells on is their elasticity and scalability, right? Horizontally and vertically, right? So they kind of saw where the industry was going, and they were able to build something for that future. This one, you might look at this and say, oh, doesn't this fly in the face of juggling and reassessing priorities? Doesn't this fly in the face of the long-term vision? It actually doesn't, right? The idea is, if you connect the dots to, a few of the things I said, if all of your decisions are tied to the whys, then reassessing priorities is not a bad idea, because you know why you're doing it, and the original whys has to be part of the story, right? If I started to build out to solve the problem X, and the problem X is valuable because Y, if I have to juggle and reassess priorities because the why has changed, or the why is there but technology has changed, we should go an alternate path. All of that is fair game. Many more such constraints are fair game, as long as we're not losing focus on the long-term vision. And this is something that is actually appreciated by many of the engineers that I've worked closely with, is my ability to go back and say, well, we started out, this was our understanding, but now look at this. So maybe we should use an alternate approach. And same with my designer partners, right? They love the fact that we could go back and reassess, but doesn't mean you go back to the drawing board and restart. It's about the constant improvement cycle, right? And this is also one of the reasons why, as a PM, I don't believe in writing an amazing PRD upfront and then sort of working with the engineers to execute on it. I also believe in product discovery from a user experience, as well as from a stated end goal perspective as we go. So you define, maybe the next 3-4 weeks of work, then you work together with the design and engineers to build something, and then you kind of always rolling, for the next 3-4 weeks, keep defining what needs to get done. Data, right? We've all heard, I'm sure, enough talks and conversations around data. I think I'll leave you with 2 quick thoughts. First is measure what matters, right? So you need to define what matters and make sure that it is measured from day one of your product. And just remember, whatever you measure will get managed, right? If you tell your team and your organization, we're going to focus on a certain conversion metric or a certain dollar metric, everybody's just going to align and get that done, because everybody comes out to do a great job. And then once they know how to measure it, they're just going to make that number move. There are pitfalls of this sometimes where you need to identify how measuring just one metric or just 2 metrics can create an environment where we're overlooking something, i.e. we can build something that works really fast, but the user experience is bad. Or we can build something that user experience is awesome, but pages load really slow. So, just taking very mundane examples, but use the data to your advantage, and make sure everybody agrees on what defines success ahead of even starting the project. This one I'm passionately in love with. I like decision-making principles to be broadly shared, and I can't emphasize the value of that, right? Very similar to what I said, a common shared understanding of the whys, a common shared understanding of decision-making principles helps everybody in the team make better decisions, right? So it is not that it was Lovelash's choice that we didn't build something or we didn't prioritize something. Nobody actually, once decision principles are rolled out and teams have agreed, nobody says that, oh, my head of product said, don't go build this. They say that here are the principles we work by, and what you're asking is something that is in direct conflict, right? They're able to tell your story for you if you're able to simplify your principles to a handful and be able to socialize them so everybody knows it. Guardrails, right? When you have principles, you also need to decide guardrails, right? If there is a decision that impacts every single user that goes through your flow, you don't want that decision to be decentralized. So you need to help your team make sure that they're able to level up when things need to be leveled up. And the guardrails are what keep you, your product, and your team on track to deliver on the vision. They're also what helps build the discipline. Platforms first. So this thinking, is one that's a big cultural shift for teams. because everybody is, it's easy to get sucked into an inward focus, say, oh, I built this page or I'm responsible for that flow, and I'm just going to focus on that. But as a platform, you have to build capabilities that are going to be used for years, right? If you're building a platform that gets end of life in a year, 2 years, not a great idea. Apps do that. End user apps can be launched and end of life in 3 months or less sometimes, right? But a platform is built to live. So your thinking, your team's thinking, your evaluation on architecture choices, engineering choices, all of that has to be with a platform's first mindset. This thing is going to live, or designing it to be extensible, to be livable. And that means sometimes at the launch of the product development cycle, the start of the product development cycle, technology teams are given more time to make the right long-term choices versus, day one, start building, start writing code. And then the next one would be consistently working backwards. Doesn't mean physically backwards, but what it means is you start with the customer, right? Every single thing you do, you build, you keep your customer in mind and in conversation. You don't go to your team and say, let's go build feature X. And they start working on building feature X. You always start with the customer. When the customer goes through this flow, here is the problem we face, or the customer faces. How should we solve it, right? And sometimes when working backwards, you tend to call yourself as a key customer of your product because you use your product every single day. And that's a fallacy to try and avoid. While you are a normally speaking, a good customer of your product, if you build it only for yourself, you're going to have a problem. So you need to be open to working backwards from different customer perspectives. And almost always starting with the null hypothesis will also help, especially in the B2B2B scenario. The null hypothesis here would be that the customer doesn't really want my product, doesn't even know that they have a pain, and is not going to pay for it, right? And then you're constantly fighting that hypothesis to figure out, how do you get the customer to pay for your product? How do you know that you're solving the right problem, that they're going to be willing to even have a dialogue with you? And then I'm going to wrap up with one of the best platforms PMs in the tech industry, right? He says, be stubborn on your vision, but flexible on the details, right? So be razor focused on the vision that you set out to deliver, but work closely with your key stakeholders to figure out the right details to get there. I think that's all I had. I'm open for questions now. We have about 15 minutes. We can go a little extra if needed.
All right. So yes, we have received a few questions from the audience, and I think we can start with Krupesh. Krupesh, I believe you have a question. Krupesh, can I ask you to come online?
I think there is a mute challenge, Nitika. Somebody has to unmute them.
Just a second. There you go.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, Lavlesh. Good morning to you and Sunnyvale. Thanks for your time for coming. So actually, I had a couple of questions. So first one was that, now you've been in the Bay Area for more than a decade, and, you've been a product manager. So how do you see product management coming up in India compared to the US? Firstly, and second thing is, in your career, you worked in IT products and now recently moved to financial products. So do you see some challenge as a PM working on financial platforms products? I know you mentioned about regulation, KYC, some of those, but fundamentally, any other differences which you've observed so far?
Sure. So we'll go one at a time. PM in India, right? So I do believe that product management in India as a profession is maturing, right? And I think that ties into part of the reason the Bangalore tech scene is Bangalore is the Silicon Valley of India, right? It started out as largely the place where consulting firms were hiring and setting up offices, right? Because it provided the right ecosystem. But if you look back at the last more than 5 years, maybe almost 10 years, there's a lot of technology startups coming out of Bangalore, and many of those products are getting to a global platform, right? So in my mind, product management as a role is getting to sort of the start of the hockey stick curve, where it sort of goes up in importance in the Indian context, right? And some of my PGPX classmates who have done their own startups, and I have had discussions along the same lines on the value of product management in the Bangalore market. And I'm sure, I mean, my knowledge currently or exposure is tied to Bangalore, so I'm referring to it, but I'm sure it applies to India technology scene in general, right? So the next question was around challenges of moving from a tech company to a financial company, right? So it's been a very interesting transition. Let's start there, right? Firstly, when I worked at tech companies, I was the business, right? I was a platform, but I was also the business. So if legal came to me and said, "Thou shall not do this," my response was, "Well, you can tell me how big of a risk it is, and I can decide whether I take it or not," right? And that's my decision, right? I own that decision. But that's not the case when I'm now working in finance, right? Finance is the business, right? Whether it is private wealth management, whether it is transaction banking, they are the business, we are the enablers, right? But if you listen to the talks on Goldman's Investor Day, at least in my case, in this situation, in a fast forward future, technology will also be the business. So that's sort of the promise with which I came. Now let's talk about the transition, right? It's interesting, or rather more than interesting now that I've been at a bank for a couple of months. The way we work is very different. The way we make decisions, like I kind of said from my technology experience, that consensus building is not big in the technology industry, right? The PMs have sort of the veto to say, here is my decision, let's execute, right? Largely sometimes in the interest of time. But given the fact that finance is, one, heavily regulated, and two, heavily documented in regards to obligations, not just to the regulators or the governments, but also to our customers, right? So it imposes interesting constraints on us, but constraints is honestly an environment in which the PMs thrive, right? Our job as PMs is to go figure out how do you deliver the best possible experiences or the best possible solutions within the given set of constraints. So far, I'm actually finding it very enjoyable. The learning curve is a bit steep, right? Because coming from high tech to an established bank with a lot of years of financial industry expertise behind their belt. So the learning curve is a bit steep, but it's an amazing journey. And I couldn't have asked for better.
Thank you, Lovelish, for taking that up. The next question I have for you is from Adi. Adi is actually joining us from London. He's a technical project manager with Google. Adi, go ahead.
Did we lose him? He
He's
was on.
unmute.
He was on the video, and then I suddenly don't see him anymore. Oh, he's right there.
Adi, are you able to talk? Okay, he's not audible.
No audio, Adi.
And he is.
How about now?
Oh yes,
Yeah,
much better.
perfect.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. Hey, Lavlesh. Firstly, thanks a lot for doing this. I think it's great for you to sort of share your experience and offer some advice. And it actually in the same tune and kind of reading the room. I think what would be on a lot of our people's minds. I think I have a sort of like really interesting question. So at Google and Facebook, we have a slightly generic product hiring process. We consider product managers to be fungible. And over a long 30-year career, you'd be expected to create product success across multiple industries and different product areas. However, when it actually gets down to the nitty-gritties of the job, across payments, maps, social, gaming, communication, B2C, B2B products, etc., and even product lifecycle, the role and the required skill set can differ considerably. And also, there's a trade-off with how domain expertise grows with time. So I think given that context, what would your advice be to a product aspirant or a budding PM? There is in terms of sort of the split between like the general elements of the job, that you can actually work towards developing versus sort of things that become slightly more specific. So how should
Yeah,
someone sort of upskill themselves and make themselves ready for a product career?
right. Interesting. So product career and product job, two different things. Any career and any job, two different things, right? So first part of your question was around getting hired for a job or how companies hire. So I'm actually extremely familiar with the generalist PM hiring process. We also ran that at some point at Yahoo, but then we kind of walked away from it. Um, so it works. Hiring a generalist PM and letting them go solve interesting problems works. It creates good PMs. In my mind, if you want to create great PMs, then that great PM, once on a certain team, has to spend enough time to understand the industry and become almost a domain expert within the company and then within the industry, right? I'm still on my journey to kind of establish myself at the industry, but within the companies that I've been able to earn respect, right? And I think that's where you can go from the generalist to specialist, right? When I started out as a product manager, identity wasn't my first role. I did that for Yahoo Search, I did that for Yahoo Mail, and then I did that for Yahoo Identity, right? And that's where now the vertical alignment plays a role. Is you as a PM have to fall in love with the product that you're going to be the industry specialist for, whether it is in-house or externally, right? Not all of us get enough external recognition. There's a lot of different rules of that game, right? But even within your team, if I take your example, right, Google Maps, for example, you have to be obsessed with that problem space for you to spend enough time to actually be the expert and be comfortable making a certain choice to say, yes, we're going to go in that direction, because I'm taking, a large team of engineers behind me and saying, let's go all in that direction. And I could walk all of us down a cliff, right? But before I do that, I need to have enough education. I need to have enough learning. So as a PM, always start humble. Always start with, I'm going to spend on a new product, I'm going to spend the next year or two just learning and training myself, right? And in many of those situations, you'll still have tough decisions you have to make. And that's where you start to, use a little bit of your team and the decision-making principles, right? You start to lay out principles early on that help you decide and help the team decide. And you use sort of the existing experts on the team to validate your principles before you start using them, right? But as a PM, it's amazing to start as a generalist. I think it provides you the opportunity to go try a few different roles. Like you could work on, product A, product B, product C, and then maybe product D is the one where you really find your passion, right? Passionate PMs almost are maniacal about the various aspects of being a product manager, whether it is, measuring the right metrics, whether it is driving up revenue, whether it is driving privacy controls to be simpler to use, whichever angle you come at, but that passion and that fire will come only at a given problem space. You can't be passionate about everything that Google or Facebook or any other large company is building, right? Then you're passionate about nothing. That's a whole other problem.
Absolutely. Um, thank you so much for sharing that. And I kind of agree as well. I think you start off in a specific area, and then it's really, it takes a while, maybe a year or two, before you find your footing and actually learn enough about the space to sort of start taking some decisions that a team can get behind,
Yep.
and actually drive impact in the medium long term.
Thank you, Adi, and thank you, Lavlesh, for taking up that question.
Sure.
We can move on to the next one. Akhilesh Bhangre has a question for you. Akhilesh, would you like to come online?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Nitika. And thank you, Lovelish, for joining us.
Sure.
So my question is, I want to narrow down the scope of financial PM down to a global banking perspective. So what I've seen in the recent years, world's biggest European and American banks have started their huge tech centers in India, and mostly they're supporting all financial operations or tech operations from India. So, for example, the Marcus from Goldman Sachs is being supported by Bangalore office. So, can you comment on the product management opportunities or product management being done in-house by these banks and the potential opportunities in that sector?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's no different than any global product being run out of India, right? To begin with. So Marcus as an example, I haven't worked on Marcus, so it's kind of hard for me to comment, right? But why don't we take a different example, and I can hopefully answer your question with that, right? I, working in the US, have built products for the EU market following the sort of requirements from the EU market, right? And this had to do with products that my company at that time, Verizon Media, was building for the EU. And I've done the same for Taiwan, right? Taiwan is a very different market from the US. Maybe Taiwan's a better example, right? Taiwan's a very different market than the US. Audience is entirely different. And we were building it, supplying a product manager, engineering, everything based out of Sunnyvale, California, right here, right? So where this comes to roost from a product management perspective is, as a PM, you need to be in lockstep with your in-market contacts, right? Many times the in-market contacts are product marketing managers. Many times in-market contacts are user researchers. I was kind of lucky and blessed in that regard that I had both in market, right? And I also had some in-market PMs actually that were partnering with me, right? So you need to be able to develop empathy for the user in their context, right? So a lot of the times when we're working, we don't spend enough time on understanding the user pain point because we know of a similar pain point in our environment, right? So if you talk about Bangalore teams developing products for the US market, right? Banking in Bangalore is very different than banking in the US, right? And in some ways, banking in the US might actually feel to you that it's a generation behind traditional banking wise, right? We don't have as many of the sort of technology products that India uses, for example. However, as you work with your partners, back to my story, right? As you work with your in-market partners, you need to develop empathy for the user. One of the tools we used in my situation was essentially conduct users research in market with users that could speak English, which in Taiwan is a very large population in my case, right? And we watch the entire video. So a lot of the PMs, when they get user research feedback, right? They're reading the report and kind of trying to derive product requirements or insights from those reports. We didn't do that in this context, right? And actually we abolished that practice after we learned from this experience, right? We ran the whole, like a typical user research session is a user walks into a lab. They are sitting in front of a computer. They're testing your flow. They're playing with your prototype, sorry, not really testing it, right? And they're thinking out loud as they go through this, right? And they're typically behind a FBI style glass window where people on the other side can watch them, watch their interactions and whatnot. And there are 3 to 4 cameras, facial expressions, hand movements, everything gets tracked. Eyeball, everything gets tracked, right? We watched the entire session, right? And if we had 7 users come over on a Friday in Taiwan office, that Friday in Sunnyvale, 5 to 6 people would sit and watch everything, every single movement that happened, right? And then you take detailed notes on what they thought, what they said, what they did. Because that's what you're trying to learn. You're trying to learn, when I launch this thing, how are the users going to interact and what are they going to think, right? And that once you develop that empathy for the user, you are actually poised to now build for the market as you were a local. You don't have to be in the market to be a local. You have to have empathy for the user who is local. Hopefully I answered your question, Akhilesh.
Akhilesh is again.
Yes, Lovelish. I think I've never thought of that kind of example. It was a lovely example of prototyping and getting the real-time expressions of users.
Yeah, I mean, we did that in the labs also in the Sunnyvale. We would essentially require engineers, people who are actually building the product, to also go to these sessions. Because many times as a PM, when you go and say, let's do something a different way or a certain way, you get a lot of pushback because that is harder to do, because it is more work than the simplest engineering solution, right? But if they've seen the user fumble, they've seen the user struggle, they also have that empathy. So that helps a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure thing.
All right, so I think we're running short of time, but can we take one last quick comment, Lovelish, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Sagar, would you like to come online?
Sure. Good morning, Mr. Chabra, and good evening,
Hi.
everyone.
Yeah.
So I saw your last slide, and I'm actually in the middle of reading the Everything Stored by Brad Stone, and how
Yeah.
many times Bezos and they mention, focus on the customer, rest everything is flexible, forest
Yep.
for the trees, and etc. So that's really inspiring that it is actually implemented by a lot of users. My question with that regards is, so there are times and we try to avoid conflict as much as we can, but
Mhm.
within the team as a leader, there are times when there's a conflict between focusing on the goals or focusing on relationships.
Mhm.
Uh, how and when do you manage? How do you manage that? And when is the time to say, okay, fine, I'm willing to compromise on the goal, but I'm not going to let go of the relationship? And sometimes you say, okay, fine, the goal is more important. How do you maintain a balance, and how do you do it?
Um, I'm trying to not sound arrogant here, but the goal should never be compromised, right? The reason you have a job, the reason other people on the team have a job, is the reason that that goal exists, or that goal is the reason you have a job. Sorry, the other way around, right? And I think the best relationships are the ones that stand the stress test of a conflict or a series of conflicts, right? As a PM, right, your job is to lead the team in a way that it makes the most business sense, it makes the most product sense to the team, right? You're also many times the adult supervision to the room, so you can't be flared up and aggressive and say, you know what, if you guys don't agree with my decision, to hell with you, I'm going to leave and find another job, or I'm going to fire you, right? That's not the intent. The intent is to bring your team along. That's where the adult supervision comes in, right? But to achieve that, at the beginning, at the start of your effort, you have to align on the what we're building and the why we're building. So the what has to be the problem that we're solving, not the solution again. Agree on the problem we're solving, agree on why that problem matters, right? And when there is a conflict, refer back to that, right? A good PM isn't worried about whose suggestion got accepted as the final outcome in a conflict. A good PM is not worried about, did I make the decision, or did the designers come back and say this was the right thing and I barely agreed with it? Or did I make the decision, or did engineering constraints drive me towards something else? That shouldn't be your bother at all, in my mind. What should be your bother is, are we sticking to the same problem space? Are we sticking to the same outcome we decided we will drive for our consumers? Are we sticking to the same goals that we set out? Goals are not, in my mind, they're not tradable for relationships. Because then the company or your product can't be successful. And if there is a strain that gets introduced, let me just take another moment here. If there is a strain that gets introduced on the why, you take the extra time, right? So there has been multiple conflicts that I came across, right? And then, depending on who the individual was, either I took them for a walk right away, a one-on-one at the end of this conflict, to say, hey, here is why that decision got made. I know that doesn't make you happy, but that's the right choice long-term for our team, for our product, right? Sometimes they were too emotional to go on a walk that day, so I wait until the next week and take them out for a dinner, lunch, whatever, right? So relationship is a negotiable agreement, and you can mend it, right? But the goal is not, right? Also in decisions, I'll now that I think of it, also in decisions, you have decisions that are cheap to undo, easy to undo. The cost to undo is low, versus decisions where the cost to undo is high. I mean, the cost to undo is high is essentially a life and death. I'm not going to let you make the wrong choice, right? If it means that I have to essentially, go escalate to your boss or their boss or the CEO or the board, I don't care, but that's the wrong choice, it's the wrong choice. I can't stand to support it, right? But if it's a decision that is easy to undo, like a few pixels here and there, font sizes, UX minor adjustments, it's okay to put an A/B out there and let the best one win, right? Put a A/B test out there, let the best one win. Sometimes you'll have these same user experience arguments, and I'll go back to the previous example that I gave, Akhilesh, right? Get a easy, quick and dirty prototype in front of 5 employees in the cafe. We just walked down to the cafe and we showed them 2 versions, 2 iPads held next to each other, and said, which one of these looks better, right? And 5 out of 5 picked A or B, right? And then problem solved. It's not my choice, it's the user's choice, right? They use the product, right? So you can find cheap ways of unblocking, but don't negotiate on the goal. That's not a good idea.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure thing.
All right. I think that brings us to the end of the session. We're out of time and rather have exceeded it now. So, Lavlesh, I'd like to, on behalf of Connections, the PGPX batch, and the IMA community, I'd like to thank you for joining us this lovely Sunday morning. It also happens to be Dashera here, so happy Dashera to you and your family.
Thank you. Happy Dashera to you all too.
Thank you. And product management, to be honest, is an aspirational field for a lot of B school students. So today's session did help us gain fresh perspective, particularly in the finance and high-tech space when it comes to PM roles. So thank you once again, and we look forward to further opportunities to interacting with you.
Yeah, I'm reachable on LinkedIn, Twitter, anything. Just drop me a note. Just don't use my IIM email address. I check that like quarterly. Every other method will work.
Yeah, I realized that when I was trying to reach out to you.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lavlesh. Have a good day.
Bye.